everyone, and welcome back to the final panel within our Aging Science track, where our panel will be discussing creating the consensus on the biology of aging paradigm. As always, we encourage questions, so feel free to add any questions or comments you have direct to our panel in the live discussion box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And now I'll hand over to our moderator, Samuel Agus. Samuel is the Chief Medical Officer of Biophytis. Thank you, Samuel.
Thank you very much, Jade, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the panelists for joining this and for the audience also for giving us the opportunity to share with you some of our thoughts. The need for consensus has arisen in various discussions in previous meetings, whereby we kind of came across the understanding that we use a lot of terms and we are not always in agreement exactly on what these terms are, and there are other terms or facets which we haven't really tackled or investigated, or that various people have investigated, but there is no clear agreement on what they are. So the goal of this session is not to create the consensus, it's to talk about how we create that consensus, but we will try to bring out maybe a few points which hopefully will further trigger this discussion. So without further ado, I would like to let my colleagues on the panel to introduce themselves, and also please for each one of you share one point or one element or one aspect which you think is really something that requires a significant discussion about consensus. And I'll start with you, Thomas. I think, Thomas, you're on mute. Just a second. Thomas, you're on mute.
Thank you. They had me muted. I had no.
Yeah.
So thank you, Samuel, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Tom Rando. I'm a professor at Stanford University School of Medicine, and in my laboratory we study the basic biology of aging with a focus on stem cell biology. Actually, we're interested in the overlap between regeneration and rejuvenation, and that has formed the basis of a lot of our work over the years. In that context, I'm the scientific founder and chair of the board of company Fountain Therapeutics that is based on the premise that aging is a malleable process, something that we can slow, arrest, and maybe even reverse. And that comes from, again, work from the laboratory, in which we will basically look to develop drugs and therapies targeted at the basic biology of aging as a way of treating and preventing age-related diseases. So that is a fundamental premise, and it's a fundamental hypothesis on which we base our work and base the company. So getting back to Samuel's question about consensus, well, that is a high bar in this field because there's not much consensus on many things related to aging. And I'll just mention just a couple of things. Even still, there's not a consensus on whether aging is programmed or not. I think it's not. On whether aging is a disease or not. I think it's not. So, those are kind of big picture questions that we could spend hours and hours discussing without reaching a consensus. The whole field continues to discuss these. What I think, well, there are probably many things that I think will be interesting to discuss in terms of where we can reach a consensus. And I'll mention one, and I'm sure Eric will come up with others and we'll discuss others. But one that I would like us to reach a consensus on are the measures of aging, the things that we will use to measure aging in humans as we develop therapeutics. It'll be absolutely essential to even have a therapeutic arm of the field of the biology of aging to have measures. And we can have measures without knowing, quote, the causes of aging, without agreeing about disease versus non-disease. These can be kind of agnostic to these underlying principles, but having fundamental agreed upon measures that track this process that we call aging and the phenotypes that we call aging phenotypes are the essential transition from aging as a descriptive field to aging as a therapeutic field that will underlie, I think, an enormous opportunity in biomedical research to advance this in terms of disease treatments.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Eric, floor is yours.
Oh, yes, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Verdin. I'm the CEO and president of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, which is a not-for-profit institute located in Northern California, just north of San Francisco. We are entirely focused with 300 employees on studying the biology of aging. I wear 3 hats. I am acting as the leader of this institution, but I'm also running my own lab, which is focused on understanding the links between nutrition and aging pathways, in particular calorie restriction, ketogenic diet. I also run my own labs. This lab is focused again on nutrition and aging. And finally, I'm the founder of a couple of companies in that space. One, BHB Therapeutics, which is commercializing a novel ketone body ester that actually mimics the ketogenic diet. The product just came online. And another company called Napa Therapeutic, which is focused on understanding the reason for the decrease in NAD levels during aging. With regards to your question, in terms of consensus, I think I'll just opine very briefly on what Tom just told us on 2 big questions. Is aging programmed? I agree with him. I don't think so. And is aging a disease? And I agree with him as well. I do not think so. So in terms of consensus, as we move this field forward, there are one of the major questions for me would be that I would love to discuss is what are we trying to accomplish? There are by studying aging, and I'll just mention briefly what our major focus is at this point. There's a growing evidence that aging is actually made. The reason I don't think it's a disease, it's actually linked to disease. It is a major risk factor for a whole series of diseases that we call the chronic disease of aging. And that's actually been a very profound finding, because it implies that if we are able to modulate the rate of aging, we will be able to affect all of these diseases together. And so this is a concept called the geroscience hypothesis, which was pioneered by one of my colleagues at the Buck, Gordon Lithgow, which actually basically formed the essence of what we're trying to accomplish. So studying aging pathways and hopefully identifying targets within these pathways to mitigate the rate of aging and thereby mitigate the risk for a whole series of diseases that, with an aging population right now is posing an increasing burden on our societies.
Thank you very much. And I will conclude with my short introduction. So I'm currently the Chief Medical Officer for a French biotech called Biophytis. I'm a neurologist by training. I've been focusing on neurodegenerative disorders and age-related disorders. And our current company is developing molecules that come out of plants. Our lead asset is called Bio-101. It's a phytosteroid, a mast receptor activator within the renin-angiotensin system, and is now in phase 3 development for muscle diseases such as sarcopenia, age-related sarcopenia, and Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but also in respiratory deterioration that is associated with COVID-19, where we're at right now in the middle of a phase 3 study. So for me, I think that in a way, my major point would be a little bit kind of the same as both of you have mentioned already, maybe looking at it a little bit different. It's more about what is the goal really of this exercise. So, as a physician that works in a pharmaceutical company, the main goal is to develop treatments that could mitigate, that could help in either slowing down, stopping, or reversing this process. And I think that it is, we need to develop this common vision of what we are trying to do, because otherwise it will be very difficult to agree on what the solutions are. Now, I don't think there's going to be a right or wrong, and there's probably going to be more than one goal and one vision of success, but we have to have that discussion. And I would just add to that, consensus doesn't mean that everybody really agrees on everything. What it does mean that everybody uses the same language. So when we say X, everybody understands what X means. And when we say Y, everybody has a good idea of what that does not mean. So with that, I think that we already have one question coming up. Actually, it's posted here twice almost, and both of you already kind of alluded to your position about aging, that it is not a disease per se. And by the way, I do tend to agree with you as well. But then the question is, and again, it's not, the goal here is not to create the consensus around that, but at least to see what grounds are we standing on. So it's a big question. We could discuss about this through a whole conference by itself, but let's try within 2-3 minutes each, just to give an opening of what do we think aging is? Is it a disease? Probably there is some consensus here, maybe it's not, although we may have other people who think it is. If it's not a disease, is it a syndrome? So where you have maybe a common phenomenology, but various causes? Or is it a disease state? In other words, it's really more unique to the diseases or to the situations that cause it. There may be some similarities between them, but there are a lot of disparities as well. So again, the floor is yours. Maybe this time, Eric, you will start.
It's an interesting question. I am not sure that, to be honest, that it is actually the most important question that we have to address. And that would be there's a lot of argument with, is it a disease, is it not a disease? It's the same question as asking, is high blood pressure a disease, or is high blood sugar a disease? By themselves, they are not diseases. They are risk factors. They actually predispose you to a whole series of secondary complications. And it's the same for a high cholesterol. I don't think anybody would call a high cholesterol a disease, but the heart attack you can get as a consequence of this would be a disease. The way I think about aging is really, there are two aspects to aging. There are a number of sort of immutable factors that we will never be able to control, which are the stresses that living on life in an oxygen-rich environment with gravity will always impose on our organism. And think about gamma rays, UV radiation, the gravity, mechanical stress. All of these are processes that our bodies are submitted to, day in and day on, and they impose a considerable stress to the point that our organism actually devotes a significant part of our energy to repair the damage. And so the way I think about aging is so we are actually doing a pretty good job at constantly repairing the damage imposed by these. The way I view aging is a subtle and progressive degradation of our ability to repair. And these damages that eventually accumulate target themselves the repair mechanism. And this is one of the things that's actually quite remarkable when you think about aging and our risk for disease, is that the curve is exponential. And that really indicates that there is something really dramatic that happens. My thinking about why, for example, is your risk of disease increasing in an exponential manner with time is probably because as you are degrading, as you are accumulating lesions or misfolded proteins or damaged DNA, eventually you start touching some of the key repair and mechanism. And once you do this, eventually the process accelerates, leading to the manifestations of aging as we see them. So I think this is how I think about aging and itself.
Thanks, Eric. Thomas, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, big question. I mean, I think my view of what aging is, how we define it, really comes from both evolutionary theory on the one hand. So I think of it, very much in terms of how universal aging is, which again suggests against any kind of disease definition, essentially almost universal in metazoan life, and how it evolved and so forth really argues against a program. And then in terms of sort of non-equilibrium thermodynamics, aging is essentially, and this very much aligns with what Eric just said, I think of it as a loss of homeostasis over time. It is, we're in a steady state and we just maintain a steady state well enough to reproduce, raise our young, and that's what we're evolved to do. And what we lose after that, or what we call aging, is a fundamentally lack of perfection in our systems of repair and maintenance. So the question of, how do we define aging? I think, this again gets to either defining mechanisms or defining causes, which I think is a challenge. I think we keep ending up going down rabbit holes when we try and do that. And I parallel that to the field of cancer, where the kind of revelation or recognition that cancer is fundamentally a genetic disease changed the trajectory of the field biologically and therapeutically. I don't think that's going to happen in aging because it is universal. It's not like we're going to say, oh, it is a mitochondrial problem, because it is partially a mitochondrial problem. It's partially a genomic instability problem. It's all of these things. So I don't think we will evolve as a field the way the cancer biology field did by trying to get at the root cause. Therefore, I think one can actually be agnostic on a lot of these underlying processes. What is the cause? What is the mechanism? Should we and focus on it? I guess, Samuel, to get more like a syndrome. That is, can we agree that these are the problems that occur, whatever caused them, and we can agree they occur. That we can agree upon. Can we measure them, and can we characterize them? So I feel like the consensus comes in the characterization of what happens as we age. So we can say it's getting better, it's slowing down, it's getting worse, and as long as we can, I think as a start, at least as a field, to agree upon that consensus to what are the characteristics, and fundamentally, we can argue whether aging starts at birth or conception. All those things, have reason to them. But when we think about aging, really, we think about decline. We don't think about growth and development. We think about you reach this, you're a young, healthy individual, and then you start to lose things. You don't run as fast. You can't remember quite as well. And so it's really, I think, built into this characterization is the notion of decline from our sort of adult steady state. If we can agree on the characterization of, what those are, what the rate is, how we measure them, that will advance the field even without knowing, quote, the cause or the mechanism, which we study and we're very interested in. But I think for this field and for this conference and for this, this particular panel, this to me feels like where a consensus is possible and is important.
Mm-hmm. So there's an interesting point that is brought up by Dr. Barzilai in his comment here. He's alluding more to hallmarks rather than pillars or maybe definitions. He's saying there are definitely a few things that perhaps we can agree upon. That first of all, there is something that is linked or related or correlated with aging. And that we can target it or as a process and maybe mimic it in animals and target it in animals and maybe even see when targeting this as that we can impact in those animal models the lifespan. And finally, that through that we can identify targets that then we can biotechnologize, so to speak, and create agents that can modulate or somehow mitigate the impacts of those targets. So are these elements, are these pillars, so to speak, are these hallmarks, not pillars, are really something that we can start from and something that we can agree upon? Eric, you're kind of nodding, so maybe you can start.
Yeah, Tom made reference to these pillars of aging, and I think this is a reference to an article that was published about 10 years ago, and that tried to actually characterize some of the main manifestations of aging at the molecular level. And I think this article was written, I think, inspired by another classic paper. It's called The Hallmarks of Cancer, and which actually really helps people in sort of organizing the field in a number of tractable pathways that people could study and address. And I think in this respect, it's a very important paper. Tom referred to some of those pillars. I mean, there are epigenetic drift, there's mitochondrial dysfunction, there's stem cell dysfunction, there's aberrant nutrient sensing. There's a whole series of them. And what they are essentially is is a categorization of all the areas that we as a field actually are addressing as potential mechanism of aging. What this paper also did that was extremely important is to come to the conclusion that there is not a single cause of aging. I alluded to this, or not a single mechanism that combats aging. And I think this is really an important distinction, because it also signifies that we're not going to find a magic bullet that's going to make people live, 500 years from what we do today. And it speaks to the complexity of the problem that we have to address. That being said, I think the field right now is moving a little bit past the hallmarks of aging, because when they were presented, there were essentially a list of projects and pathways. What many of us are doing in the field right now is trying to actually understand whether there is any hierarchy between these hallmarks of aging. Are some more important? How interconnected are they? For example, I'll just give you an example of a paper that we just published. It's been known that senescence is one of the hallmarks of aging, and so is aberrant nutrient sensing. Well, we just found published a paper showing that senescent cells actually secrete the SASP, these pro-inflammatory protein, and some of them actually induce enzymes that consume NAD. And we know NAD depletion is part of the aberrant nutrient sensing that happens during aging. So I think, and this is just one paper from our group, there are many others that are doing exactly the same thing, trying to build I think about aging as a network, as a complex network problem. I think one of the challenge that we have right now is to identify the nodes. What are the key proteins that are, that we really need to target? Which one will synergize? We have a number of drugs, for example, right now that we can use and increase lifespan. Which of these drugs are going to work together? It turns out that when you, at least from preliminary experiment that I've heard about, when you start adding drugs that prolong lifespan individually, if you reach a number of 3 or 4, you lose most of your effect. And I think this speaks again to the type of complex network biology that we're going to be to have to address in the future. So I think these are some of the challenges that I view. Is really we have a very fragmented understanding of aging. Think about it as if you were a mechanic. We are actually at the point where we're taking the car apart. We have all the pieces laying on the ground, but we don't have a full understanding of how all these parts actually are related to each other. And we certainly have not identified the key nodes. For example, think about the computer of the car that just actually makes everything work together. I think this is our challenge for the future.
Thank you very much. Before I continue, I just want to address 2 questions, comments. One from Robert Zeman about, is this a part of the roadmap for healthy longevity? At this stage, I cannot answer this question. I think that this is something that those who were involved in that project will be perhaps Eric, were you a part of that project?
Yes, I think it's probably not the best place to talk about this right now. It is a project that's ongoing, but it has not reached its conclusion. And I think we should let that commission do its work and then let it come to its own conclusion.
Although by creating a roadmap, hopefully that is in part also a roadmap for some degree of consensus. Yes. So that's a partial answer to this question, I guess, but yes. We'll hear more about that. An interesting suggestion from Georg Füllen. I hope that I pronounced your name correctly. Aging are the processes that reduce future health and survival. And I think that it's slightly in the direction of what also was mentioned by Dr. Barzilai beforehand. I just want to actually use this as going back to the original question that I've put and explain why I think that this is an important question, because it has a lot of practical implications when it comes to the process of developing medications. For instance, if aging indeed is a disease by itself, then one could argue that you can do clinical trials in aging per se, as long as, of course, you make sure that you have defined the right population. Whereas, and this is probably a little bit more the view currently, the regulatory view, and I think that we at least have our questions about that as well. If aging is not a disease by itself, then it has to be addressed within a set of conditions that cause it, even if it is a syndrome. And definitely if it is not even a syndrome, if there are only similarities to it. And I think that that's why it is something that it's probably an effort that needs to take place, and maybe some sort of group that can start to pick this up. We have only 3 panelists, and I'm pretty sure that we're not covering all the opinions here. And I want to stress that we all have opinions. I mean, we all base them on science, but are still opinions. And consensus is bringing those opinions together and making sure that they can happen. So my next question is, so how do we turn this into practicality? So we took the first part of the discussion and we showed that we have some diversity, some areas where we have some agreements. We had some good comments from the audience. What do you think, and Thomas, this time you will start. Sorry to kind of put you on the spot immediately. What would you think would be probably a good next best step to move towards developing such a consensus, let's say, on this topic, whether it is the most important topic or not, that we can have another discussion on that. But let's say it is an important, maybe one of the important topics of what is aging biologically. Is it a disease, a syndrome, and so on and so forth? And this is really a more practical question. Who do you think we should bring in, and how do we start this broader discussion?
Okay, so if I understand the question, again, quite broad, but circling back to the question of consensus, number one, but also practicality, like how do we use the current knowledge to advance therapeutics? I mean, are you specifically talking about therapeutics?
Well, not necessarily therapeutics, although I think it will benefit, of course, therapeutics.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, so Samuel, just so you know, I'm also a neurologist by training, and the reason why I say that is because using the hallmarks, paradigm is challenging. So I think of it this way. I think when experts in the field read a paper like that, all you see are things that you think are not represented and are different. And you would, just like when you read a textbook of neurology, that's for the general, but that every one of these sentences has a lot of information behind it that's not included. And so I think it's a fine paradigm for the field, but then, in your own work as an expert in the field, you realize what the challenges are, how to move this forward. So I think within the field, it's really important not to get hung up on a model, like this is the way the field thinks about this, but to really look at, what are the unknowns, and where are we pushing the envelope here? In terms of thinking of this practically, the challenge of any kind of hallmarks or pillars, because there was a separate paper on pillars of aging, which had a different spin than the hallmarks of aging, and it's really asking, how do we take the current biological research and translate that into therapeutics? And so let me just mention again, Fountain Therapeutics, the company that I founded, has an approach that is really quite agnostic. So we do phenotypic screening of aging of cells and tissues, and that basically we don't care whether the origin of that was genomic problems or proteostasis problems. It really is, like looking at a whole person and seeing how old they are, and can you modulate that by intervening in one of these potentially targeted processes, or in a process you don't even know, using kind of unbiased screening. So I think that is, that approach combines the kind of more molecular reductionist approach that has been more traditional in biopharmaceuticals. And I think it's important in aging because it is so phenomenological. I think it would be a mistake and Eric sort of referred to this, to say, okay, we're going to focus all our attention on NAD, or all of our attention on, sirtuins or something like this, or whatever pathway one or IGF. And I think there are, undeniably important biological processes that relate to aging that are based on these biochemical processes, but they are so interrelated that the more you dig, you can find connections between all of these pathways. And again, Eric used the term node, and I would use that too. That these are all many nodes that connect to this homeostatic system that we call, life, basically. And as they go awry, we start to see dysfunction. So, and dysfunction is very generic, right? So in that sense, phenotypic approaches, I think, are the way to go, as opposed to causal approaches. And again, I see this as a distinction between how cancer evolved therapeutic and how we will evolve as a field. So, so I think it's important to keep high level view of this, and to basically understand the underlying network problems that we're seeing. And that translates into therapeutics quite directly. Now, Samuel, I'll just make one other comment is, you asked about how we will end up having clinical trials, quote, on aging. I think, again, it's impractical to think that we will treat people for long periods of time just to look for aging, but we will look for prevention or delay of disease. I think those can be done aligned with current FDA standards in a way we can treat pre-disease, early disease, pre-symptomatic, even risk factors for disease, and look for the effects of treatments directed at the basic biology that will end up being therapeutics for age-related diseases, but targeted to the basic biology of aging.
Eric?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Tom just said. I just want to maybe expand a little bit on this whole idea that actually faces our industry. If you think about the aging research field, is now entering a really critical phase, which is taking all of this knowledge that's been accumulated for the last 25 years. So our understanding of the sort of molecular genetics, molecular biology of aging has really increased dramatically in the last 25 years. So now, what do we do with this? How do we transfer all of this knowledge into practical medicine information that actually the human population can use to live better longer? And I think, it's interesting to see the different ways in which the field is actually moving in its direction. And I categorize it in three main approaches. One of them would be represented by the pioneering work that Nir Barzilai has actually conducted, which was to really actually bite into this model that aging is a risk factor for multiple diseases. So why don't we take a drug that we think interferes with aging pathway, in this case metformin, and actually follow the course or the occurrence of these multiple diseases together. And this is what the essence of the TAME trial that Nir has actually managed to get through the FDA, and that I believe will start in the near future. So the patients will be put on metformin, and instead of following the occurrence of a single disease, they will be monitored for heart disease, for neurodegeneration, for cancer, and it's the aggregate of these diseases that will define whether the drug is working. So I think that's number one. Number two is an approach that's been taken. I'll give you an example from Unity, which is a company that was spun out of the Buck in collaboration with Mayo Clinic, which is focused on discovering senolytics, these drugs that actually are eliminating senescent cells. The approach that they've taken is to look for known human conditions, diseases, and identify those in which there is a heavy senescent cell burden. And those actually, so for example, a good example, knee osteoarthritis or glaucoma or macular degeneration is a disease that they've identified. And what they do then is conduct clinical trials that are looking at a single condition in which we know that senescence is a main factor, give senolytics and follow the outcome. So that's number two. And I think this is partly the approach that's being followed by most biotech companies in the space right now. The third one, I think, is the most exciting. It is essentially reinventing what we consider a disease. Because even though I would argue that aging itself is not a disease, it is manifested by a number of development that individually can be considered as a disease. And I'll give you three examples. One is thymic atrophy. We know that, actually 4 examples. Thymic atrophy is something that happens in all of us when we're 50, your thymus atrophies. That means you lose the ability to generate new T cells. That impairs your immunity. Are there ways to actually to revert this or to prevent it? So that would be number 1. That's not defined as a medical condition, but it could be. The same for ovarian failure in menopause. Same thing that happens in most women around 50. There is some evidence that we could delay this. It's a predictor of your aging rate and so on. Another one would be sarcopenia. Again, loss of muscle mass associated with aging. I know Tom works very much in this space. That is now being defined as a condition. And the last example that I could give you is a failure to vaccinate. We know that if you are above 70 years old, this has become actually really important with COVID-19. If you're above 70 years old, your success rate with most vaccines would be 30%. And so can we not do better? Can we actually conduct clinical trials that would really address this specifically? And a company such as Restore Bio was actually trying to do this. So I view this really as an exciting way to look at the process. And this will allow us to identify a series of manifestations that we can target individually. Finally, one last word about this whole idea of clinical trial in aging. I want to highlight, as Tom has, the important role of biomarkers of aging, which you cannot cure something that you cannot measure. And I'll give you as a good example what measuring cholesterol level has done for the whole field of heart disease. It's now a $20 billion market annually for statins. It was based on our ability to measure cholesterol and our ability to determine that cholesterol is an indicator of your future risk of heart disease. So the field right now of biomarkers of aging is exploding in terms of its diversity. There is still no consensus. This is one area where we will have to determine consensus. What are the best markers? What are the markers indicating? And so I think, to me, that this is right now where I think we should focus a lot of our effort.
Right. So, sorry, we have less than 10 minutes left to the end of this discussion. And I want to take a little bit of a holistic overview, maybe also kind of using some of the terms that have been used. I've heard about risk and prediction. I have heard about prevention, early prevention versus late prevention. I know we talk about primary, secondary, tertiary prevention, but I don't want to go to split hairs on this one. and I want to present a scenario and ask you if you think this scenario on the practical level is something that makes sense. And perhaps this could maybe, if it makes sense, is this something that afterwards we can offer perhaps as a basis for consensus? And I'll take the example of frailty. What is frailty? And in fact, what is it for the patient? What are the families describing? So we did a market research when I was in the area, when I was involved in drug development in Alzheimer's disease. And in that market research, one of the questions was, so how did you get to know about your relative having Alzheimer's disease? And actually, it was surprising. The most common answer, and Thomas is a neurologist, you probably would say, yes, of course, that's how it is. Most people said, well, in fact, it was when something bad happened. Either a mom had to go to the hospital with UTI, daddy had a hip fracture, and they never came back. And it dawned on me, because also as a practitioner, you see those patients all over the hospital in medical wards, and when they call in neurologists, say, hey, what's going on here? This guy was functioning until 3 days ago. Now he had some small intercurrent UTI, and he's not back. So he must have had a stroke or something like that. And, in the beginning, I would do a lot of investigations. Normally, we wouldn't find any stroke. We wouldn't find anything that would explain that. And I think that this is kind of the concept of resilience here. So each one of us would fall into the flu, and we would lie in bed when we believe we're going to die, and it's going to be the worst thing ever. And then a couple of days later, we recover, we go back to work, we go back to the gym, we're pretty well functioning. So this is resilience, right? We're not resisting the flu. We're just able to bounce back from this very detrimental level of function into which we were forced for a couple of days. But for people who are frail, there's no way of bouncing back. So say we have a process, okay? Let's say we have defined a process that is common to this group of people and that we have defined this group of people. And most importantly, we have defined this group of people at the time when this could happen, let's say at 40% in the next 12 months. And now we have an intervention and we will reduce this bad thing, this tipping point, so to speak, by the occurrence of that by 20%. Wouldn't that be something that could be very, very meaningful for any stakeholder to say, okay, now I get it. Okay, you're taking people who have a likelihood to basically stop functioning sometime during this year, and for half of them, you were able to stop it. It's not slowing disease, although it could be in the background slowing the disease process. It would be more kind of a tertiary prevention, if you may. What do you think of this approach? Could this be something that we can take with us? And maybe Thomas, your turn now.
So interesting question, Samuel. I think fundamentally what you're getting at here is, it does overlap with the idea of treating the basic biology of aging, meaning, because I consider the word you use, resilience, we use that all the time at Fountain. That's what we think we're studying. It is the ability to maintain homeostasis. That's what resilience is to bounce back from stress. And what you described is absolutely right, that, that patients who are kind of on the brink or declining, they suffer a stress, whether it's a urinary tract infection or whatever it is, and they don't bounce back. So their resilience, their homeostatic mechanisms are impaired. And so I think that just becomes another, Eric gave sort of 4 examples of ways to approach different conditions and through the biology of aging. And I think you're coming up kind of with another one, is what if we developed therapies that we knew targeted the basic biology and we administered them to people who are otherwise, we're not treating a disease, but we're preventing something from happening. Again, we'd have to measure what it is we're treating, because many of these people won't have a UTI in the next couple of months. But having said that, that is, I think, fundamentally very much aligned with the geroscience hypothesis, with the idea of treating aging as a risk factor and loss of resilience as a risk factor for these other bad things that happen. And I think, along with, Dr. Barzilai's TAME trial and other people will have to be creative, which is kind of what you're getting at, in how we think about doing this. We have to get away from the traditional, we have a target, we have a disease, we treat those people who have disease, and we think about this as a preventive therapeutics approach. And that's it's a different mindset from the traditional pharmaceutical approach. But it is basically targeting the basic biology in enhancing resilience and preventing the subsequent development of decline and impairment of function. So I think, again, what you're suggesting, Samuel, really is yet another way of what if we do it this way? What if we do it this way? And I think that what we're going to see in the next decade is very creative clinical trial development in terms of, okay, we're going to get away from the traditional approach and we're going to try these other approaches where our measures are this, our approach is this, and we are treating people who don't at that moment have a disease. We're treating them based on a risk factor they have, and that risk factor is measured by a biomarker of age.
Yeah, thank you. Eric?
Yeah, great points, Tom. Another point that I would like to make is this idea that let's look at medicine as it is practiced today. And what I'm about to say is not a critique of medicine, because I think it is this medicine that has brought us to where we are today with, a 2-year gain of lifespan every decade, which is a remarkable achievement for the last 150 years. However, I think we've reached the limit of this model system, and which is essentially treating diseases. If you think about what medicine is today, you are considered healthy until you reach 62 years old or 65 and you have a heart attack that in 30% will kill you at first sight. So can we do better? This really brings into light what we know from the biology of aging, that aging is a process that starts when you're 30 years old, and it is slowly cumulative. And the earlier you interfere, the earlier you modify your risk factor, the better your outcome is. So I think what this really brings into light is the need for medicine to reform itself and to become really much more focused on prevention versus on treating disease. And so what I envision, and I think many of us envision in the field, is a model where you would start seeing your doctor on a regular basis when you are 30 years old, mitigating all of your risk factors. We talk a lot about drugs and therapeutics. I want to remind the audience also that 93% of your longevity in terms of health span and lifespan is actually determined by lifestyle effect, not by your genes, lifestyle factors. And I believe, these are equally important to the development of drugs. And we all know about them. This is the pillars here are nutrition, sleep, stress, exercise. What is not clearly known, even though we know every one of these is actually remarkably powerful, what we do not know is what are the modalities by which we can administer these lifestyle changes. And I think this really calls for a lot of research as well. We know exercisers live longer, they live healthier, they're protected against cancer, against Alzheimer's disease. So what form of exercise? Should you do, yoga? Should you do running? Should you do strength training?
Resistance training, yeah.
Resistance training. So I think there's a need for a lot more research using all of the biomarkers of aging that we have now and our understanding of these pathways to really link these dietary, physical exercise, sleep, mitigation, all this. And I'm equally passionate by those. I believe we see, a lot of new companies emerging that are trying to practice medicine based on these new models. And I'm equally excited by those as I am by the development of new drugs.
Thank you very much, Eric. We have to wrap up. I just want to mention two more comments, which I think are worth certain consideration in the future. Measuring ATP, that's a comment from Larissa Andreeva about measuring ATP levels as a marker, and another question from Lynn Cox about tying the whole concept into financial models. I'm assuming we can talk about healthcare and management, insurance, and whatnot. I just want to wrap up by saying a couple of things. First of all, hopefully this would have been the opening of an effort to create some degrees of consensus, and again, not by having 100% consensus, but some degree of understanding of an agreement about what we're talking about. The second point, I think that we brought some interesting thoughts about maybe risks, maybe addressing risks and looking at predictability, at the prediction that they make. And finally, to Eric's point, and as a person who works in the pharmaceutical industry, I would say, yes, indeed, more than 90% of what we can do is not drugs. Drugs come in very late and probably should be reserved for cases where lifestyle by itself is not enough. I just want to mention a study that showed that people who start exercising at the age of 60 actually within a short period of time begin to win most of the benefits, probably not in a significant difference from those who exercised all of their lives. So it's not saying exercising all of your life is a waste of time. You're just saying anytime you start is good. And with that, I would like to wrap up and thank you very much for your comments, ideas, and thoughts, and to the audience also for your thoughts and ideas and for listening.
Great, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. And thank you, Samuel, for that great moderation and for that great discussion. Thank you, Thomas and Eric, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on this interesting topic. So, thank you all. So that concludes our live content for this year's Longevity Leaders World Congress. A special thank you to all our great speakers, moderators, and partners over the last 2 days. Just a quick reminder to everyone watching that the platform will be open and stay live until Friday the 14th. So you can rewatch any of the content throughout that time, as well as access to partnering. Hopefully next time we will see you all in person next year at Longevity Leaders 2022 conference. Thank you and goodbye.